How Made in China went from cheap to world class. There was a time when Made in China meant one thing: cheap. You saw that label on the bottom of a toy, a pair of shoes, a dollar store gadget, and you knew exactly what it meant. But today, China produces nearly 30% of everything manufactured on the entire planet, more than the United States, Japan, and Germany combined. You heard that right. One country now outmanufactures the three industrial giants that dominated the 20th century put together. And the shift from cheap goods to world-class manufacturing didn't happen by accident. It was engineered, step by step, over decades. To understand how, you have to go back to the moment it all started, when a country of farmers decided to become the factory of the world's factory, in 1978. China was one of the poorest countries on the planet. Most of its population, nearly 1 billion people, lived in rural villages, working the land the same way their grandparents had. The economy was closed, centrally planned, and falling behind. Then a man named Deng Xiaoping changed everything. Deng didn't try to reform the whole country at once. Instead, he carved out 4 small zones along the southern coast: Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen, and turned them into experiments. These special economic zones offered foreign companies something irresistible: rock-bottom labor costs, tax breaks, cheap land, and almost no red tape. The message was simple: bring your factories here, and we'll build your products for a fraction of what it costs you back home. And the world took the deal. Western companies rushed in. They brought their designs, their blueprints, their brands, and Chinese workers assembled it all. You got cheaper shoes, cheaper electronics, cheaper everything. The companies got wider margins. And China got something even more valuable than money. It got knowledge. Every factory that opened was a classroom. Chinese workers and managers learned how global manufacturing actually worked: the processes, the standards, the logistics. They were absorbing decades of industrial knowledge in real time. But what made this transformation staggering wasn't just the factories. It was the people. Over the next 2 decades, hundreds of millions of workers left their villages and poured into the coastal cities. It was one of the largest human migrations in history. Young men and women leaving behind rice paddies and dirt roads to work 12-hour shifts on assembly lines. By the early 2000s, the stock of rural migrants working in urban areas had surpassed 290 million. Entire cities sprang up almost overnight. Shenzhen went from a fishing village of 30,000 people in 1980 to a roaring metropolis of over 12 million in just 25 years. And during this era, Made in China genuinely did mean cheap. That was the whole point. China wasn't trying to compete on quality or innovation. It was competing on price, pure and simple. And it worked. By the turn of the century, China had become the undisputed workshop of the world, producing everything from toys to textiles to the components inside your computer. But here's what most people missed. This model had a timer on it. Wages were rising. Competitors were circling. And the very thing that built China's dominance, cheap labor, was about to become its biggest vulnerability. Why cheap wasn't enough by the late 2000s? Cracks were starting to show. The formula that had turned China into the world's assembly line, low wages, long hours, endless labor, was running into a wall. Chinese factory wages had been climbing steadily for years. And countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Indonesia were now offering what China once had: workers willing to do the same jobs for even less. For the first time, the world's factory was being undercut on price by hungrier competitors. Then came the blow nobody saw coming. The 2008 financial crisis ripped through the global economy, and China felt it in the worst possible way. When American and European consumers stopped spending, Chinese factories went dark almost overnight. Millions of migrant workers were sent home with nothing. And in that moment, a terrifying reality set in. China's entire economic engine depended on someone else's appetite to buy. If the West stopped shopping, China stopped working. That kind of vulnerability, for a country with ambitions this big, was unacceptable. But instead of panicking, the Chinese government did something that would reshape the next 2 decades. It looked at the problem and decided the answer wasn't to compete harder on price, it was to stop competing on price altogether. In 2015, Beijing unveiled a plan called Made in China 2025, and this wasn't some vague policy paper. It was a surgical, state-coordinated blueprint to drag the entire economy up the value chain. The targets were specific: robotics, aerospace, biotech, semiconductors, new energy vehicles, artificial intelligence, advanced rail, maritime equipment, new materials, and biopharma. 10 sectors, 10 bets on the future. The goal was no longer just to make things, it was to invent the things you make, and the money followed. China's R&D spending exploded from under 1% of GDP at the turn of the century to nearly 2.7% by 2024, totaling over $500 billion a year. That made China the second largest R&D spender on the planet, closing in on the United States and surpassing the average of the entire European Union. This wasn't a slow drift toward innovation. This was a government telling an economy of 1.4 billion people, "We are done being the world's cheap labor. We build our own future now." And if you think that was just talk, wait until you see the numbers that came out the other side. The numbers no one can ignore. So what did all of that investment actually produce? Let's talk numbers, because the scale of what China has built is almost hard to believe. Today, China accounts for nearly 28% of the world's entire manufacturing output. That's $4.66 trillion more than the United States, Japan, and Germany produce combined. But that headline number only tells part of the story. When you zoom into specific industries, the dominance becomes even more staggering. Take steel. China produces over 53% of the world's crude steel, more than 1 billion metric tons a year. That's more than the rest of the planet put together. And it's not just heavy industry. China now manufactures over 80% of the world's solar panels, controlling every stage of the supply chain from raw polysilicon to finished modules. A solar panel made in China costs about 50% less than one made in Europe and 65% less than one built in the United States. That's not a slight edge. That's a different universe of cost efficiency. Then there are batteries. Chinese manufacturers now control nearly 69% of all EV battery installations worldwide. Just two companies, CATL and BYD, account for more than half of the global market between them. And the control doesn't stop at the finished product. China processes around 60% of the world's lithium, 70% of its cobalt, mines more than 2/3 of the world's graphite, and holds roughly 90% of global capacity for the cathode and anode materials that go inside every lithium-ion battery on the planet, and in electric vehicles themselves. China now controls over 70% of global EV production, with domestic sales surpassing 11 million vehicles in 2024 alone. You heard that right. One country builds 7 out of every 10 electric vehicles on Earth. Now, step back and think about what all of this means for you. Your phone, your laptop, the solar panels on your neighbor's roof, the battery inside the electric car you're thinking about buying. Chinese manufacturing is embedded in almost everything you touch. This is no longer about one sector or one product. It's about breadth and depth at a scale no other country has come close to matching. But here's the part that really changed the game. This dominance didn't come from faceless factories churning out components in silence. It came from specific companies that decided to stop following and start leading. The companies that stopped following. If you want to understand what Made in China means now, you don't look at trade statistics. You look at 3 companies: Huawei, BYD, and DJI. Because what these 3 have done tells you everything about where Chinese manufacturing is headed. Start with Huawei. In the 1980s, Huawei was a tiny telecom reseller operating out of a small office in Shenzhen. Today, it's one of the largest telecommunications equipment makers on the planet, holding over 150,000 active patents worldwide. In 2024 alone, Huawei poured nearly $25 billion into research and development. That's over 20% of its total revenue. More than half of its entire workforce, 113,000 people, work in R&D. But here's the part most people don't realize. When the United States cut Huawei off from American chips and software, most analysts expected the company to collapse. Instead, Huawei did something that stunned the industry. It developed its own chipsets through its high silicon division. It built its own operating system, Harmony OS, from the ground up. By late 2024, Harmony OS had surpassed iOS in market share inside China and was running on over 1 billion devices. The company that was supposed to die without American technology came back stronger using technology it built itself. That's not assembly, that's invention. Then there's BYD. If Huawei is the story of defiance, BYD is the story of total control. BYD started as a battery manufacturer in the 1990s. Today, it's the world's largest electric vehicle company, delivering 4.27 million vehicles in 2024, more than twice Tesla's output. But what makes BYD terrifying to its competitors isn't just the sales numbers, it's how it builds those cars. BYD manufactures roughly 75% of its own components in-house. Its batteries, including the revolutionary Blade battery, its semiconductors, its motors, its power electronics. It even owns its own lithium mines and operates its own cargo shipping fleet. From the raw minerals underground to the finished car on a ship crossing the ocean, BYD controls the entire chain. During the global chip shortage that crippled automakers like Ford and General Motors, BYD didn't just survive, it increased production. When you hear about the future of electric vehicles, you're hearing about BYD whether you know it or not. And then there's DJI, the one most people underestimate. DJI is a Shenzhen-based company that commands roughly 70 to 80% of the global commercial drone market. In the consumer space, it controls over 90%. Its closest competitor, Autel, barely registers at around 1.4%, despite years of U.S. government restrictions, sanctions, and billions in subsidies funneled to American drone companies trying to catch up. DJI's grip on the market hasn't loosened, it's tightened. And DJI didn't get there by copying someone else's design. It got there by out-engineering and out-iterating every competitor on the planet, leveraging Shenzhen's unmatched supply chain to prototype and refine products faster than anyone else could even react. These three companies share something in common. None of them succeeded by being the cheapest option. They succeeded by being the most integrated, the most relentless in R&D, and the fastest to scale. And they're not outliers. They're the blueprint for what Chinese manufacturing has become. But companies alone don't explain this transformation. Behind Huawei, BYD, and DJI, there's a system, and that system is what the rest of the world is truly up against. The system nobody can copy. This is the part of the story most people never hear. Because when you look at China's manufacturing dominance, it's easy to focus on the companies, the products, the numbers. But the real advantage isn't any single company or any single factory. It's the system those companies operate inside a system so dense, so fast, and so deeply interconnected that no other country on Earth has been able to replicate it. It starts with something called supply chain density. In most countries, if you want to build a piece of consumer electronics, you're sourcing components from 5, maybe 10 different regions. In Shenzhen, you can source every single part for a smartphone without leaving the city. Circuit boards, sensors, camera modules, batteries, casings, screens, all of it within a few miles of each other. There's a district called Huaqiangbei that stretches across multiple city blocks, packed with thousands of stalls selling every electronic component imaginable. Engineers walk in with a rough sketch and walk out with the parts they need sometimes within the hour. A rare camera sensor that would take 6 weeks to source in the United States or Europe? In Huaqiangbei, you can have it in your hands before lunch. That kind of proximity collapses timelines in ways that are almost impossible to compete with from the outside. And that feeds directly into speed. Hardware entrepreneurs who have worked in both the US and China say the same thing: a week of product development in Shenzhen is equivalent to a month in the West. You can go from a concept to a working prototype in days, not months. Factories are flexible enough to rearrange production lines in hours. One engineer described arriving at a Shenzhen factory, leaving for lunch, and coming back to find working samples of a new circuit board already assembled. That's not an exaggeration, that's the pace Chinese manufacturing now operates at. And when you can iterate that fast, you don't just build products quicker, you learn quicker. You fail quicker, you improve quicker. Every cycle of trial and error that takes a Western company a quarter takes a Shenzhen team a week. But the most significant shift isn't speed, it's automation. In 2024, China installed 295,000 industrial robots, more than every other country on the planet combined. That's 54% of all industrial robots deployed globally in a single year. China's total operational stock now exceeds 2 million units, representing nearly half the world's industrial robots. And for the first time, Chinese-made robots outsold foreign brands inside China, capturing 57% of the domestic market. Factories in sectors like automotive, electronics, and new energy are increasingly running with minimal human intervention. Fully automated lines operating around the clock, with AI handling quality control, predictive maintenance, and logistics optimization. In Chongqing, a single car factory, powered by over 2,000 robots, assembles a new vehicle every 60 seconds, at 20% lower cost than traditional methods. This is the part that should keep every competing nation awake at night. China didn't just build factories. It built an ecosystem, supply chains, clusters, speed, automation, and AI, all woven together into a machine that moves faster, costs less, and scales harder than anything else in the world. And now, that machine isn't just serving China anymore. It's going global, exporting the machine. And this is where the story takes its biggest turn. Because China isn't just manufacturing for itself anymore. It's not even just manufacturing for Western brands anymore. It's exporting the entire manufacturing model, the infrastructure, the expertise, the supply chain playbook to the rest of the world. You've probably heard of the Belt and Road Initiative. Most people think of it as a bunch of roads and railways. But that's only the surface. What China has actually been doing is building the architecture for a global manufacturing network. Ports in Djibouti and Pakistan, railways connecting Addis Ababa to the sea, industrial parks in Ethiopia, Egypt, Nigeria, and Zambia, free trade zones across Southeast Asia. Over 150 countries have signed cooperation agreements under the Belt and Road framework. And in those countries, China isn't just pouring concrete, it's setting up factories, transferring supply chain knowledge, and embedding Chinese manufacturing standards into local economies. Take Ethiopia. Chinese companies have built 11 of the country's 18 industrial parks. The oldest one, the Eastern Industrial Zone near Addis Ababa, houses dozens of Chinese manufacturers and employs over 26,000 local workers. The Hawassa Industrial Park further south had 35,000 workers at its peak, 97% of them Ethiopian. These aren't charity projects. They're strategic extensions of the Chinese manufacturing system into new territories, creating jobs and production capacity, while locking in trade relationships for decades to come. And it doesn't stop at developing nations. Chinese EV and battery companies have poured over $143 billion into foreign ventures since 2014, building battery plants in Hungary, Indonesia, and Germany. BYD is assembling vehicles in Brazil and Southeast Asia. CATL is constructing a 100-gigawatt-hour battery facility in Hungary. For the first time in 2024, Chinese EV companies spent more on building supply chains abroad than they did at home. This is the part that changes the global equation. China is no longer just the factory. It's becoming the architect of how manufacturing works everywhere. It's franchising its own playbook. And while Western governments talk about decoupling and bringing production home, the reality on the ground is moving in the opposite direction. Unwinding from Chinese manufacturing sounds compelling in a speech. But when one country controls the supply chains, builds the infrastructure, trains the workforce, and sets the standards, walking away isn't just difficult. For most of the world, it's not even an option. And that brings you to the question nobody wants to answer. What the rest of the world is up against, so where does that leave everyone else? If you're sitting in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, you're watching all of this unfold, and the response so far has been a scramble. The US passed the CHIPS Act, pouring billions into domestic semiconductor production. Europe launched its own industrial strategy. India is pushing Make in India as hard as it can. These are real efforts, backed by real money. But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody in those rooms wants to say out loud. You can build a semiconductor fab. You can subsidize a battery plant. You can announce a new manufacturing initiative with a press conference and a ribbon cutting. But you cannot replicate, in 5 or 10 years what China built over 4 decades. The gap isn't just about money or policy. It's about density, the thousands of suppliers clustered within miles of each other. It's about institutional knowledge, the millions of engineers and factory managers who've spent their entire careers refining production processes. It's about speed, the ability to go from concept to prototype to mass production in a timeline that Western companies can't even comprehend. And it's about scale, the sheer volume of output that drives costs down to levels no one else can match. The rest of the world isn't competing with Chinese factories. It's competing with the Chinese system. And that system has a multi-decade head start, a workforce of hundreds of millions, an infrastructure network that spans continents, and a government that treats manufacturing dominance as a matter of national survival. Every country trying to catch up is essentially trying to build a machine, while the machine is already running at full speed on the other side of the world. And every year the gap doesn't close, it compounds. That's not a political talking point. That's the math, the label that changed its meaning. So the next time you pick up a product, any product, and flip it over, and you see those 3 words stamped on the back, understand what you're actually looking at. Made in China is not what it was 20 years ago. It's not a warning about flimsy plastic and cut corners. It's not a punchline about knockoffs. That label now represents the most integrated, most scaled, fastest-moving manufacturing ecosystem ever constructed by any nation in human history. The phone in your pocket was assembled by it. The solar panels spreading across rooftops in your city were born from it. The electric vehicle your neighbor just bought, its battery, its motor, its semiconductors, all of it flows through a system that one country spent 4 decades engineering from the ground up. And the drone flying over the construction site down the street, the one capturing footage and mapping terrain in real time, that's a DJI, built in Shenzhen. Designed, prototyped, and shipped at a speed no competitor has figured out how to match. This didn't happen because China got lucky. It didn't happen because wages were low. Wages stopped being low a long time ago. It happened because an entire nation decided, deliberately and systematically, to stop being the world's assembly line and start being the world's factory of the future. From Deng Xiaoping's first special economic zone in 1980 to the Made in China 2025 blueprint, every step was calculated, every investment was intentional. Every setback, rising costs, trade wars, sanctions, a global financial crisis was absorbed, adapted to, and turned into fuel for the next leap forward. And now, that system isn't just producing goods, it's producing the infrastructure, the standards, and the supply chains that other countries depend on. From the industrial parks of Ethiopia, to the battery plants of Hungary, to the EV showrooms of Southeast Asia. The Chinese manufacturing machine is embedding itself into the global economy at a depth that makes it nearly impossible to untangle. You can debate the politics. You can argue about tariffs and trade balances and who's winning the technology race, but the facts on the ground don't care about any of that. Nearly 30% of everything manufactured on this planet comes from one country. 1 in every 10 industrial robots on Earth was installed there last year alone. One country builds 7 out of every 10 electric vehicles, produces more than half the world's steel, and controls 80% of the solar panel supply chain. That's not a trend. That's not a phase. That's a transformation, and it already happened. The only question left is whether the rest of the world can adapt fast enough to keep up. Because Made in China didn't just change what it means on a label, it changed what it means to manufacture anything, anywhere, in the 21st century.